Ghost Story. Disturbing true parenting horror stories. David drove slowly down the empty street, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Sitting in the back seat, Melissa gently cradled Emily, their newborn daughter. After 9 long months of waiting, they were finally bringing her home. Their house was in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb, a neighborhood of classic-style homes, spacious front yards, and towering oak trees providing shade. As David opened the car door, a strangely cold night breeze brushed against his face. He shivered but quickly dismissed the feeling. Melissa carried Emily into the bedroom and placed her in the small crib beside their bed. The room was decorated in warm tones, with a soft nightlight casting a gentle glow. David stood nearby, watching his wife and daughter, feeling all his exhaustion melt away. But just a few hours later, they realized their peaceful night wouldn't last long. At around 2 in the morning, Emily's cries startled Melissa awake. She threw off the blanket and nudged her husband. "David, the baby's crying." David groaned but sat up as well. Melissa walked over to the crib, but before she could pick Emily up, she froze. There was a sound, very faint, almost a whisper. She turned her head, scanning the room. Aside from the dim light from the night lamp, nothing seemed out of place. The room was as quiet as before. David switched on the main light and stepped closer. "What's wrong?" Melissa looked at him, shaking her head. I just heard something." David frowned, then chuckled. "It's probably just the wind outside." Melissa didn't argue. She simply picked up Emily and gently rocked her back to sleep. The crying faded into soft whimpers. But as she placed her daughter back in the crib, an uneasy feeling crept over her, like someone was watching. The same thing happened every night after that. At exactly 2 in the morning, Emily would wake up screaming. At first, Melissa assumed it was just colic or nightmares, but as the nights went on, she began to suspect something else. One night, while David was sound asleep, Melissa leaned against the bed, her tired eyes fixed on the crib. The nightlight cast shifting shadows on the walls. She wasn't afraid of Emily crying. She was afraid of what happened every time she closed her eyes. Then, she heard it, a whisper, right next to her ear. Melissa froze. Her heart pounded as she turned her head, scanning the room. It was empty. Slowly, she stood up and approached the crib. Emily had stopped crying, her wide eyes staring up at the ceiling. Melissa swallowed hard. She leaned down and gently lifted her daughter's tiny shirt, checking for anything unusual. And that was when she saw it. On Emily's back, just below her shoulder blade, was a birthmark. It wasn't large, but its shape sent a chill down Melissa's spine. It wasn't just a faint discoloration. It looked like a tiny handprint gripping the baby's skin. She stepped back, trying to steady herself. It could just be a coincidence. Just an ordinary birthmark. Melissa stared at the birthmark on her daughter's back. Its shape was too distinct to be a coincidence. She reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingertip brushed against it, Emily flinched and let out a piercing cry. A chilling sensation spread through Melissa's arm. David woke up to see his wife standing motionless beside the crib. He walked over, looking at her with confusion. Melissa turned to him, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "This birthmark, it looks like a handprint." David frowned and bent down to examine it. He stared for a moment, then let out a small chuckle. "It's probably just a birthmark. Babies get these all the time." Melissa said nothing. She picked Emily up, holding her tightly against her chest. The uneasy feeling didn't fade. Ever since they had come home, something felt wrong. The following nights, Emily's crying only worsened. Every night at exactly 2 in the morning, she would scream as if something was hurting her. Melissa barely slept, dark circles forming under her eyes as exhaustion took hold. But more than the fatigue, she started noticing things. Sometimes, when she turned away and then quickly looked back, Emily's crib would sway slightly, as if someone had just touched it. Other nights, she heard faint sounds, like fingernails scratching against wood. One evening, while changing Emily's clothes, Melissa discovered another mark, a faint red imprint just below the birthmark. The unease inside her grew stronger. She decided to confide in her close friend Sarah. Sarah was a nurse with experience in newborn care. When she saw the birthmark, she hesitated for a moment before reassuring Melissa that it was likely just skin pigmentation. However, the moment Sarah took Emily's tiny hand, the baby let out an ear-splitting wail. At that exact moment, Every light in the room flickered erratically. Melissa and Sarah exchanged glances, neither speaking. The air in the room felt colder, unnaturally so. Sarah quickly withdrew her hand, her face pale. She suggested that Melissa see a doctor if she was too worried. That night, after David had fallen asleep, Melissa sat beside the crib, her eyes fixed on her daughter. She wasn't sure how long she stayed there before her eyelids grew heavy. Just minutes after closing her eyes, she heard a sound. Not Emily's cries, something else. Breathing. Melissa shot up, scanning the room. The darkness swallowed everything, except for the faint glow from the hallway. Slowly, she got out of bed. Everything looked the same, but something was moving in the shadows. She reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered for a second, before fully illuminating the room. Emily's crib was no longer in its usual spot. It had been pulled over half a meter away. Emily still lay inside, her wide eyes staring up. Her tiny arm was outstretched, fingers grasping at the empty air, as if reaching for someone. Melissa stepped back, a cold dread washing over her. She rushed forward, scooping Emily into her arms. The moment she touched her daughter, she realized her skin was colder than it should be. She held Emily closer, turning toward the crib. Beneath the thin blanket, something shifted. Melissa stared at the crib. The thin blanket was still shifting, moving, despite the fact that she had already picked Emily up. Her throat went dry, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She clutched her daughter tightly, stepping backward. The ceiling light flickered erratically. The once quiet room now felt suffocating, the air thick with something unseen. Then a sound, faint, deliberate, like fingernails scratching against wood. Melissa shook her head, trying to convince herself that she was just exhausted, that her mind was playing tricks on her. Forcing herself to move, she took a trembling step forward and slowly lifted the blanket with a shaking hand. There was nothing underneath, but just as she turned away, she heard it, a small, breathy giggle. Melissa whipped around, heart hammering against her ribs. The room was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the hallway light. In her arms, Emily suddenly burst into terrified sobs, her tiny body trembling. Melissa didn't hesitate. She bolted out of the room, holding Emily close to her chest. As she reached the living room, a fresh wave of dread washed over her. Every light in the house had gone dark. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling them in their frames. She called out, her voice cracking. "David?" No response. Her phone sat on the coffee table. She grabbed it with one hand, trying to steady her shaking fingers. The screen lit up. A message appeared, "I want her." Melissa's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled, but before she could react, a loud crash came from Emily's room. She snapped her head toward the hallway. The bedroom door had swung open, and then, footsteps. Melissa staggered backward, clutching Emily tightly. The house was swallowed in darkness. The phone in her hand flickered, the screen flashing erratically before shutting off completely. Then the footsteps came, slow, unhurried, but unmistakably real. Melissa swallowed hard, struggling to steady her breathing. Emily clung to her, tiny fingers digging into her shirt, her trembling body pressed against her mother's chest. Where was David? Where had he gone at a time like this? The footsteps stopped, right at the threshold of the living room. A heavy silence followed. Melissa stood frozen, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might give her away. Then, the ceiling light flared to life for the briefest second, and in that fleeting glow, she saw it, a figure, standing in the doorway. Its face was obscured, its form blurry, but its eyes, those she could see, deep, black, endless. Then, darkness again. Emily screamed. Melissa's grip on her daughter tightened as she spun toward the front door. She reached for the lock, fumbling with trembling fingers. Before she could turn it, the door jerked violently, as if someone on the other side was holding it shut. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned back. The figure was still there, watching, waiting, no time to think. Melissa bolted toward the stairs, taking them two at a time. She reached the bedroom, shoved the door closed behind her, and locked it. Pressing her back against the wood, she tried to steady her breath. Emily was still crying, her sobs breaking into gasping hiccups. Melissa forced herself to move. She reached for the nightstand drawer, hands shaking as she searched for her backup phone. When the screen lit up, she didn't hesitate. She called David. The line rang, once, twice, then someone answered. but the voice on the other end wasn't David's. Melissa pressed the phone tightly to her ear, trying to keep her trembling hands from dropping it. For a few seconds, there was only silence on the other end. Then a voice, low, drawn out, distorted as if being strangled. The words were garbled, breaking apart between bursts of static. She couldn't make them out. Then a slow, heavy breath crackled through the line. The voice spoke again. "Give her to me." Melissa hung up immediately. Her arms tightened around Emily as she backed away from the door. She knew David's voice, and that wasn't him. A soft knock echoed from the other side. Not frantic, not impatient, just slow, steady, unwavering. Melissa clamped a hand over Emily's mouth, trying to muffle her cries. The air in the room thickened, growing heavy with an unbearable stench, something rotten, putrid, like decaying flesh. Then a sound, a slow, deliberate scrape, as if something was dragging its nails down the wooden door. Melissa's pulse pounded in her ears. She scanned the room, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Then, the phone on the bed vibrated. The screen lit up. A new image had appeared. It was a photo of her, but not one she remembered taking. She was in the picture, holding Emily. Her back was turned toward the door, and behind her, in the farthest corner of the room, a tall, shadowy figure loomed, standing perfectly still. Melissa spun around. The corner was empty, but behind her, the door creaked open. Melissa held Emily tightly, but the child's body was ice cold. She looked down, empty eyes, a faint, eerie smile. A whisper echoed in her mind, both unfamiliar and strangely familiar. A tiny hand touched her face, the skin so thin she could feel something moving beneath it.